I am Hannah, 29 years old, and my mother kicked me out of my own house with my newborn just to make room for my sister. But my name was on the deed. So that night I protected my baby and claimed everything by answering through the intercom and saying three simple words that made my mother drop her phone to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set boundaries to protect your peace against toxic family members. The glow of my computer monitors provided the only illumination in my temporary home office. At 8 months pregnant, my physical reality was a constant state of exhaustion. The dull ache in my lower back radiated down my legs, a persistent reminder of the physical toll of carrying a child alone. As a data analyst working remotely, my days were consumed by massive spreadsheets, predictive models, and endless lines of code. The digital world made sense. The numbers behaved logically, following rules and establishing patterns that I could control and predict. It was the perfect sanctuary from the messy, unpredictable devastation my personal life had become. My fingers moved aggressively across the keyboard typing commands to run a final query before midnight. The rhythmic clicking of the keys was usually a comforting sound, a steady heartbeat of productivity that drowned out my internal grief. But tonight, the sharp flare of a phone screen interrupted that rhythm. The caller identification displayed my mother Brenda calling. A profound sense of dread washed over me, heavy and suffocating. Brenda rarely reached out unless she required something, usually something substantial. My breathing grew shallow as I stared at the vibrating device. I knew I should ignore it, let it go to voicemail, and protect my fragile peace. However, a lifetime of conditioned obedience forced my hand. I accepted the call, putting her on speakerphone while bracing myself for the inevitable storm. Without skipping a single beat or asking about my well-being, Brenda launched into a frantic, manipulative tirade. Her voice filled the quiet room, echoing with manufactured panic. She was demanding that I immediately transfer a massive sum of money to clear the maxed-out credit card balances of my younger sister, Brittany. Brittany was the unquestioned golden child of our family, a former teen beauty queen whose entire existence revolved around curated social media posts and relentless demands for luxury. She had recklessly accumulated staggering debt, and Brenda expected me to serve as the financial safety net, just as I always had in the past. My mother painted a dire picture of Brittany losing her apartment and facing financial ruin, attempting to guilt me into swift compliance. I closed my eyes and firmly rejected the demand. I stated clearly that I would not deplete my resources to fund my sister and her irresponsible lifestyle. The air grew thick with my mother experiencing immediate outrage as she accused me of being a selfish, ungrateful daughter. As her barrage of insults continued, I remained silent, drawing strength from a monumental secret I had been guarding for months. My mother believed I was barely scraping by in a tiny, overpriced rental. She had no idea about the massive financial fortress I had constructed in the wake of unspeakable tragedy. Just months earlier, I had lost my husband in a sudden catastrophic accident. The grief had nearly broken me, leaving me a pregnant widow forced to navigate the darkest chapter of my life entirely alone. But instead of crumbling, I had channeled every ounce of my sorrow into protecting our unborn son. I had taken my husband and his substantial life insurance payout, combined it with years of my meticulous savings, and purchased an extraordinary property. It was a sprawling 5-bedroom smart home situated securely within a highly exclusive gated community in Chicago. To ensure absolute privacy and protect my assets from my financially draining family, I had orchestrated the entire purchase under a limited liability company. I named the corporate entity Leo Holdings, dedicating the impenetrable sanctuary entirely to my son. My mother continued her verbal assault through the phone speaker, entirely oblivious to the vast resources I now commanded. When her anger failed to secure the funds she desperately wanted, I heard her sharp intake of breath. She abruptly shifted her strategy, executing a pivot so manipulative it left me momentarily stunned. The hostility vanished from her voice, replaced instantly by a cloying, heavy performance of deep maternal concern. She began weaponizing my widowhood and my advanced pregnancy against me. She spoke softly about how difficult it must be for me to face the impending birth alone, without a husband to hold my hand. She cried genuine-sounding tears, insisting that she could not bear the thought of her eldest daughter bringing a child into the world without family support. She proposed an immediate solution, demanding that she move into my home to help care for me during my final month of pregnancy and the postpartum period. She promised to cook clean and provide the motherly comfort I so desperately needed. The sheer weight of my physical exhaustion and the lingering raw grief of my widowhood created a tiny crack in my defensive walls. I was so tired, so isolated, and so fearful of going into labor alone that a small, vulnerable part of me wanted to believe her performance. Against my better judgment, and against every logical instinct my analytical brain possessed, I reluctantly agreed. I established strict boundaries, stating she could stay in the guest wing and nowhere else. She eagerly accepted the terms, loudly praising my decision. As I ended the call, I stared at the dark screen of my phone, completely unaware that by letting her in, I had just unlocked the gates to my fortress and set the stage for the most devastating betrayal of my entire life. The screen of my phone faded to black, leaving me in the silent shadows of my office. That quiet isolation shattered barely 2 days later when a blinding pain seized the back of my neck and my vision narrowed into a terrifying, blurry tunnel. The journey to the hospital became a chaotic blur of flashing fluorescent lights and rushing medical personnel. My blood pressure had skyrocketed to dangerous levels, turning my anticipated delivery into an immediate fight for survival. The medical staff moved with urgent clinical precision, rushing me through sterile corridors as monitors screamed continuous warnings about severe preeclampsia. Without a partner to hold my hand or advocate for me in the chaos, the terrifying reality of an emergency cesarean section isolated me completely. The harsh glare of the surgical lights beat down on my exhausted face, while the cold, heavy numbness of anesthesia crept up my spine. My son Leo was brought into the world amidst the frantic, rapid instructions of surgeons. His first sharp cry cutting through the metallic clattering of the operating room. They whisked him away for immediate observation, leaving me shivering violently on the surgical table, entirely alone to absorb the massive physical trauma of a brutal delivery. For the next 5 days, my recovery room transformed into a solitary confinement cell. The physical agony of the deep surgical incision made every breath and every slight movement a monumental effort. I sat propped against stiff hospital pillows, surrounded by the rhythmic humming of heart monitors and the impersonal bustling of shift-changing nurses. My only connection to the outside world was the glowing screen of my smartphone, which I checked obsessively every passing hour. I watched the heavy wooden door, hoping my mother would fulfill the grand promises of maternal care she had wept over during our last phone call. Instead, my inbox filled with a steady stream of dismissive, impatient text messages from Brenda. Whenever I asked when she might arrive to meet her newborn grandson, she offered transparent, flimsy excuses. She claimed she was entirely too busy deep cleaning my house to prepare a perfectly sterile environment for the baby. She sent lengthy messages detailing how she was tirelessly organizing the nursery and wiping down baseboards, insisting that her absence from my hospital bedside was an act of devoted service to my child. The empty visitor chair next to my bed mocked her digital lies. I spent my days and nights navigating the grueling schedule of nursing and pain management without a single familiar face to offer a cup of water or a word of encouragement. I learned quickly how to maneuver my broken body out of the narrow hospital bed, relying entirely on my own strength. The morning of my discharge finally arrived, bringing a mixture of profound relief and overwhelming physical weakness. My hands trembled as I carefully strapped my tiny, fragile son into his infant car seat. The hospital staff wheeled me out to the curb, offering sympathetic smiles that only highlighted my solitary departure. I requested a rideshare, gingerly sliding into the back seat and securing Leo next to me. The driver merged onto the highway, beginning the long journey back to my gated community in the Chicago suburbs. Every pothole and sudden stop sent shooting pain through my healing abdomen, but a fierce protective determination burned through my exhaustion. I was bringing my son back to the absolute safety of the fortress I had built for him. I envisioned the quiet warmth of our smart home, the secure locked doors, and the pristine nursery waiting for us. The drive felt endless, my head leaning heavily against the cool glass of the car window while I kept a protective hand resting gently on the handle of the infant carrier. The heavy iron gates of my residential community finally parted, welcoming us back to the private manicured streets that represented the ultimate security I had painstakingly purchased. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders, anticipating the quiet recovery period ahead of me in the peaceful sanctuary I had earned. As the rideshare vehicle made the final turn onto my street, the anticipation of peace evaporated instantly. The car slowed to a halt at the edge of my driveway, and my analytical mind immediately registered a cascade of visual anomalies. Parked diagonally across my wide concrete driveway, aggressively taking up 2 full spaces, right in front of the private garage, sat a massive, flashy, luxury sport utility vehicle. My stomach plummeted as I instantly recognized the obnoxious chrome detailing and custom oversized rims. It belonged to Malik, my arrogant image-obsessed brother-in-law. The sheer blatant disrespect of the terrible parking job was entirely characteristic of him, but his uninvited presence on my private property made absolutely no logical sense. My eyes darted from the heavy vehicle to my normally pristine, meticulously landscaped front lawn. Carelessly stacked across the manicured green grass were dozens of heavy cardboard moving boxes, haphazardly piled alongside overflowing black trash bags and random pieces of cheap, scuffed furniture. Several large plastic storage bins were literally spilling their messy contents onto my expensive slate walkway, ruining the clean aesthetic. The serene, secure sanctuary I had desperately dreamed of returning to looked like the chaotic epicenter of a disorganized eviction. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs, pumping pure adrenaline through my deeply exhausted system and temporarily masking the sharp, searing pain of my fresh surgical wound. The driver parked the car, casting a highly confused, nervous glance at the sprawling disaster covering the front of the property. I unbuckled my seatbelt with shaking fingers, clutching Leo tightly to my chest, as a cold, terrifying realization settled heavily over me. This was not a simple afternoon visit or a minor family misunderstanding. This was a hostile, aggressive invasion deliberately orchestrated while I was completely trapped in a sterile hospital bed, fighting to survive the highly complicated delivery. The rideshare driver pulled away rapidly, leaving me entirely alone standing on the freezing concrete of my private driveway. The biting Chicago wind whipped around me immediately, cutting through my thin winter coat and biting deep into my healing surgical wounds. Every single step toward my front porch required immense physical effort and an agonizing exertion of mental willpower. I gripped the heavy plastic handle of the infant carrier tightly with both hands, relying on pure adrenaline to keep my trembling legs moving forward. I carefully navigated around the haphazard piles of cheap cardboard boxes and overflowing black trash bags that littered my previously immaculate front lawn. The sheer volume of discarded junk piled up against the exterior walls of my house made my chest tighten with rising panic. My breathing grew incredibly shallow and labored as I slowly approached the concrete porch steps. The heavy custom front door of my smart home was propped wide open, completely defeating the advanced security system I had paid a massive premium to carefully install. A large, dirty red brick had been forcefully shoved against the doorframe to keep it permanently ajar. The freezing winter air was rushing freely into the foyer, stripping away all the warmth and safety I had envisioned for my newborn son. I crossed the newly stained threshold, pulling the baby carrier flush against my chest to firmly shield his fragile body from the bitter, hostile draft blowing aggressively through the completely ruined entryway of my beautiful home. The interior of my carefully curated sanctuary had been forcefully transformed into a chaotic disaster zone of unimaginable proportions. Muddy footprints tracked aggressively across the polished hardwood floors, creating a filthy brown path leading directly into the main living area. My tired eyes widened in absolute horror as I took in the deeply chaotic scene unfolding right in my living room. Brittany's three unruly children were treating my expensive custom-ordered white sofa like a personal trampoline. They bounced aggressively on the delicate fabric, wearing heavy winter boots caked in dirty melting snow and dark street grime. Dark brown, thick mud stains smeared across the pristine upholstery, instantly ruining the absolute most expensive piece of furniture I ever owned. Standing right in the very center of the total destruction was my younger sister, Brittany. She looked entirely unbothered and completely amused by her children destroying my highly valuable property. Instead, she was loudly clapping her hands and shouting impatient directions at a pair of cheap, careless movers she had clearly hired off the street. My heart plummeted into my stomach when I realized exactly what the movers were carrying. They were aggressively maneuvering my heavy, solid oak bedroom furniture blindly down the main hallway. They carelessly scraped my expensive dresser against the freshly painted drywall, leaving deep, ugly gouges and chipped paint in their wake. I watched in totally paralyzed disbelief as they forcefully shoved my intimate personal belongings toward the narrow door leading down to the freezing, unfinished basement. A sudden, overwhelming wave of maternal panic and intense outrage broke through my physical exhaustion, shaking me out of my temporary paralysis. I tightened my protective grip on the infant carrier, ensuring my newborn son remained completely secure against my chest before stepping forward to intercept the rapidly escalating chaos. I loudly demanded that the cheap movers drop my furniture immediately and commanded absolutely everyone to stop destroying my private property. The movers paused in their tracks, looking confused by the conflicting instructions, while Brittany simply rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, irritated sigh, as if my presence in my own home was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to her day. Before she could offer even one of her signature heavily entitled excuses, a heavy wooden door opened down the hall. Brenda emerged from the master suite hallway, stepping out boldly with an air of absolute unearned authority. She did not rush forward to greet her widowed daughter or ask to look at her new grandson who was crying softly in his carrier. Instead, she crossed her arms defiantly and positioned herself squarely in the exact middle of the corridor, acting as a hostile physical barricade between me and my own bedroom. Her stiff posture was rigid, and her expression held no warmth, no maternal concern, and absolutely no single trace of guilt. She looked down at me with a smug, terrifyingly cold demeanor that instantly suffocated any small, lingering hope I had for her unconditional support. Brenda did not flinch once or offer a single word of comfort as she delivered the ultimate backstab. She looked me directly in the eyes and casually announced that Brittany and Malik had recently been evicted from their luxury rental apartment due to unpaid bills and severe financial mismanagement. Rather than holding her golden child accountable for her reckless choices, Brenda had unilaterally decided to sacrifice my safety to provide for them. She spoke with a chilling, arrogant finality, dictating the new living arrangements for my home as if she held the deed herself. She boldly declared that strictly because Brittany and Malik had 3 growing children and a perfectly intact marriage, they constituted a real complete family. Therefore, according to her twisted, warped logic, they required and inherently deserved the sprawling master suite and the entirety of the upper floors for their comfort. She waved her manicured hand dismissively toward the dark, terrifying, narrow stairwell leading underground. She coldly decreed that simply since I was now a grieving, widowed single mother with only a tiny baby, I required far less living space. She commanded me to take my newborn son and move my remaining possessions down into the damp, freezing, unfinished basement so I would not be a burden to my sister. The sheer calculating cruelty of her decree echoed through the ruined foyer as she smiled a satisfied, victorious smile, completely confident that I was too physically weak and emotionally broken to fight back against her hostile takeover. I refused to allow her smug satisfaction to dictate the outcome of this horrific invasion. Despite the excruciating throbbing in my abdomen and the overwhelming physical exhaustion weighing down every muscle, I straightened my posture and stepped directly toward the barricade she had formed. I adjusted my grip on my son's carrier, ensuring he remained securely anchored against my chest, and projected an unwavering aura of absolute authority. I directed my attention past my mother, locking eyes with the careless movers hovering near the hallway entrance. I issued a firm, non-negotiable command, instructing them to immediately release my solid oak furniture and exit my private property without causing further damage. I made it clear they were actively participating in an illegal home invasion and would face severe consequences if they scraped another inch of my drywall. The hired workers hesitated, casting nervous, uncertain glances between my commanding presence and the chaotic scene unfolding in the living room, clearly recognizing the sudden legal liability of their current employment. Brittany scoffed loudly from her position on the ruined sofa, rolling her eyes in a dramatic display of entitlement, but her arrogance faltered slightly under my intense glare. I turned my absolute focus back to the woman attempting to block my path, demanding that her entire parasitic entourage pack up their trash bags and vacate my premises without a single moment of further delay, establishing an unbreakable boundary that I was fully prepared to enforce by any necessary means to protect my home. Rather than retreating in the face of my unwavering demands, Brenda escalated her aggressive tactics, leaning into a deeply calculated strategy of psychological manipulation. She stepped even closer, attempting to use her physical presence to intimidate me into submission. She asserted her absolute dominance over the situation, weaving a fabricated legal narrative designed to make me feel entirely powerless in my own sanctuary. She boldly claimed that she had already established formal, undeniable residency within the property during my agonizing 5-day hospital stay. She detailed her methodical, deceptive actions, explaining how she had intentionally signed for multiple official delivery packages from the Neighborhood Homeowners Association using her own signature. Furthermore, she boasted about officially rerouting her personal mail and billing statements to my private address, creating a documented paper trail of her occupation. She weaponized this twisted logic to declare herself a legal tenant protected by state eviction laws. She insisted with terrifying confidence that any local law enforcement officers responding to a distress call would view our conflict as a simple civil dispute, and completely refused to remove her or my sister's family from the premises without a formal, protracted court order. She painted my legal ownership as a temporary, fragile illusion, projecting an aura of absolute certainty that she had legally and procedurally outmaneuvered a physically compromised widow who lacked the strength to fight back against her intricate web of deceit. She stood tall, expecting my exhausted mind to surrender entirely to her manipulative, legally sounding jargon. The intense standoff rapidly deteriorated from a psychological battle into a highly volatile, dangerous physical altercation. I firmly stood my ground on the soiled hardwood floor, absolutely refusing to surrender my painstakingly acquired sanctuary to her deceitful machinations. My sheer refusal to fold under her intense pressure caused her mounting frustration to boil over into unfiltered, explosive rage. Her eyes darted away from my face and locked intensely onto the heavy, fully stocked diaper bag slung securely over my right shoulder. With a sudden, vicious, and entirely unprovoked movement, she lunged forward, her hands grasping the thick nylon strap. She violently ripped the heavy bag from my arm, the sudden force pulling me dangerously off balance and straining my healing core. She spun around with aggressive momentum and hurled my essential supplies straight out through the open entryway. The heavy bag flew through the freezing air and crashed onto the frosted concrete, sending sterile bottles, clean blankets, and necessary medical supplies scattering across the dirty, icy walkway. Before my exhausted brain could fully process the theft and destruction of my vital newborn supplies, she turned her unhinged aggression directly onto my physically broken, recovering body. She stepped aggressively into my personal space, raised both of her hands and delivered a brutal, forceful shove directly to the center of my chest, aiming to completely expel me from my own property. The sheer malice behind her violent action demonstrated a horrifying willingness to sacrifice my physical safety just to secure a luxurious living space for her golden child. The violent impact sent brutal shockwaves of agonizing, searing pain slicing directly through my fresh surgical incision. I stumbled backward uncontrollably, my winter boots sliding dangerously on the muddy, polished foyer floor. I desperately twisted my torso mid-fall, utilizing every remaining ounce of my fading physical strength to shield the infant carrier and absorb the blunt force of the stumble. I crossed the newly stained threshold backwards, my heel catching the hard edge of the concrete porch step as I fought a terrifying battle to maintain my balance on the icy exterior landing. I gasped for air as the freezing, brutal Chicago wind instantly bit through my clothing, shocking my overheated, adrenaline-filled system. Brenda stepped squarely into the doorframe, glaring down at me with unmasked, primal hostility. Without a single ounce of maternal hesitation, she kicked the heavy red brick out of the doorway. The massive, custom-built front door swung shut with terrifying heavy speed. The thick wood slammed perfectly into the reinforced frame, instantly cutting off the chaotic, destructive sounds of the interior invasion. A fraction of a second later, the sharp, agonizing mechanical sound of the smart deadbolt engaging echoed loudly across the quiet, manicured suburban street. The digital security keypad flashed a solid glowing red light, sealing the impenetrable physical barrier between me and my stolen sanctuary. The frigid winter temperature began to plummet further as dark approached, leaving a fragile, bleeding widow stranded on a frozen porch with a newborn baby. The bitter cold of the Chicago evening slashed across my face, but the initial shock of the physical assault quickly evaporated. I stood barefoot on the icy concrete of my front porch, staring at the solid red light of the deadbolt. A typical reaction might have been to pound desperately on the heavy wooden door, or to collapse onto the freezing ground in a puddle of helpless tears. Instead, a profound, terrifyingly cold calm washed over my entirely exhausted system. The raw, primal instinct to survive and protect my vulnerable child instantly overrode the searing pain radiating from my healing surgical incision. I looked down at my newborn son, Leo, who was beginning to stir uncomfortably in his carrier. I carefully unzipped my heavy winter coat and securely tucked his small, fragile body directly against my bare chest, ensuring my own body heat would shield him from the plummeting temperatures. My breathing steadied, transforming from frantic, panicked gasps into calculated, measured breaths. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my smartphone, gripping the cold metal device with absolute, unwavering determination. The glowing screen illuminated my face in the gathering darkness, serving as my only weapon against the hostile invasion occurring mere feet away. I stared at the high-resolution display, feeling the overwhelming rush of digital power coursing through my veins, completely eclipsing the physical weakness that had previously threatened to drag me down into sheer, miserable despair. My mother fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the battlefield she had chosen. Brenda operated under the outdated assumption that physical possession of a space equated to absolute control. She genuinely believed that throwing a heavy lock and establishing a fraudulent paper trail of stolen mail deliveries granted her ultimate authority over my sanctuary. What she catastrophically failed to comprehend was that I had not merely purchased a house made of bricks and drywall. I had meticulously engineered a highly advanced, fully integrated digital fortress. As a professional data analyst, I spent my entire career building, securing, and manipulating complex network architectures. I had personally wired, configured, and encrypted every single automated system within this property under my exclusive administrative control. My thumb hovered over the biometric scanner of my phone, instantly granting me unrestricted access to the central nervous system of the entire estate. I bypassed the physical lockout with a few rapid, precise taps on my encrypted application, rendering her physical barricade entirely obsolete. My analytical mind detached completely from the emotional betrayal, treating the hostile occupants inside simply as unauthorized rogue elements that needed to be systematically purged from my highly secure network with cold precision. The digital warfare commenced with swift surgical precision. I navigated directly to the primary network dashboard and initiated a total communications blackout. I rapidly rewrote the master cryptographic keys, instantly changing the main wireless internet passwords and permanently booting all of their unauthorized devices off the local network. Brittany and Malik were suddenly stripped of their vital social media lifelines and cellular data offloading capabilities. Next, I targeted the physical access points. With 3 consecutive keystrokes, I completely disabled the exterior and interior physical keypads, wiping their memory banks clean and ensuring that no sequence of numbers could ever manipulate the deadbolts. I then accessed the environmental control interface. The smart thermostat, which Brenda had undoubtedly cranked up to accommodate her luxurious comfort, was entirely at my mercy. I executed a hard override, terminating the connection between the wall-mounted displays and the central heating, ventilation, and air conditioning units. The massive digital furnace in the basement immediately powered down. The comforting hum of the warm air rushing through the vents ceased abruptly, ensuring the interior temperature would soon perfectly match the freezing, hostile environment they had banished me to. I systematically severed their access to every modern convenience, transforming my luxurious property into a dark, freezing isolation chamber perfectly designed to break their arrogant spirits. My final sequence of commands elevated the digital retaliation into a full-scale containment protocol. I accessed the deepest layer of the property management application and engaged the ultimate emergency lockdown sequence. This feature had been originally designed to protect the home from violent external threats during catastrophic events. Now I was deploying it to neutralize the internal parasites. I swiped my finger across the bright red confirmation slider on my screen. Instantly, a series of heavy mechanical whirs echoed from the exterior walls of the property. Thick, reinforced steel security shutters smoothly descended over every single ground floor window, sealing off all visual access to the outside world and plunging the interior rooms into absolute suffocating darkness. The internal smart locks embedded within the hallway and bedroom doors simultaneously engaged with simultaneous heavy clicks, freezing the floor plan and restricting their physical movement between the partition zones of the house. Brenda, Brittany, and Malik were now completely trapped inside a highly secure pitch-black freezing vault without any heating network access or functional light sources. They had aggressively conspired to forcefully push me out into the bitter winter night, but my rapid technological counterstrike had successfully imprisoned them within the very walls they had so greedily sought to steal. I stood very quietly on the freezing porch, holding my safely swaddled son, feeling the triumphant vibrations of the heavy steel shutters locking firmly into place. The bright glowing screen of my phone confirmed that the massive architectural trap had been sprung flawlessly. I had neutralized their entire physical advantage without ever raising my voice or striking a single blow. The balance of power had completely shifted, restoring my absolute dominance over my stolen sanctuary and preparing the stage for their impending, unavoidable reckoning. The icy wind continued to howl around me, but a fierce internal warmth radiated outward from my chest, completely driven by the absolute certainty that my carefully laid digital snare would soon force my utterly deceitful family to their knees, begging for the very mercy they had violently denied me just moments before. The freezing wind whipped across the porch, but the digital glow of my smartphone screen commanded my entire focus. I shifted my weight, ensuring my newborn son remained completely insulated beneath my heavy winter coat, and tapped the icon for the internal security cameras. The high-definition feed materialized instantly, granting me a perfect unobstructed view of the main living area. Inside my stolen sanctuary, the scene unfolding was one of absolute arrogant celebration. My mother and younger sister were lounging amidst the chaotic piles of their belongings, entirely oblivious to the mechanical trap that had just definitively sealed them inside. The pristine white sofa, already ruined by muddy boots, now served as their throne. I watched through the crisp lens as Brenda casually reached into a cardboard box, retrieving an expensive bottle of red wine and 2 elegant crystal glasses. A wide, victorious smile stretched across her face as she poured the dark liquid, handing a glass to Brittany. They raised their drinks in a triumphant toast, celebrating their successful hostile takeover and the brutal eviction of a recovering widow and her infant. Their body language exuded pure, unadulterated entitlement. They genuinely believed they had won, completely unaware that the ambient temperature around them was already beginning a rapid, steep decline, following my environmental override. I stared at the screen, observing their celebratory gestures with the detached analytical precision of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a carefully constructed snare. I navigated away from the video feed for a fraction of a second, accessing the central audio control matrix of the property. The house was equipped with a state-of-the-art integrated surround sound system with high-fidelity speakers seamlessly embedded into the ceilings of every major room. I bypassed the standard volume limits, pushing the audio output to its maximum capacity. I then engaged the two-way intercom feature directly from my mobile device, linking my microphone to the massive internal speaker network. I did not intend to scream, argue, or beg for my home back. Emotional outbursts were exactly what Brenda thrived on, as they allowed her to twist the narrative and play the victim. Instead, I took a slow, measured breath, allowing the freezing air to sharpen my focus. I pressed the transmission button and delivered a singular, chilling directive. I spoke exactly 3 cold, commanding words, instructing them to check the legal property deed. My voice echoed through the sprawling dark house like a booming, unavoidable thunderclap, completely shattering their delusion of control. On the security feed, the physical reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. The sudden booming reverberation of my voice echoing from the ceiling startled Brenda so violently that her fingers completely lost their grip. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her hand, plummeting toward the floor. I watched the expensive red wine splash violently across the hardwood, the fragile glass shattering into hundreds of tiny, jagged pieces around her expensive boots. Brittany leaped up from the ruined sofa, her celebratory demeanor instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The audio feed picked up their panicked, overlapping voices as the reality of the digital blackout finally crashed over them. I watched as Brenda frantically rushed toward the hallway, aggressively slapping the wall-mounted smart panels in a desperate attempt to restore the lighting and temperature controls. The screens remained completely dead, totally unresponsive to her frantic, commanding touches. Brittany sprinted toward the front foyer, throwing her entire body weight against the massive custom door, completely failing to move the heavy wood against the engaged security deadbolt. The thick steel shutters covering the windows blocked any ambient streetlight from entering, plunging them deeper into the terrifying, freezing darkness of their own making. The temperature drop was now visibly affecting them, their panicked breaths forming small visible clouds of condensation in the rapidly cooling air. Trapped inside the impenetrable freezing vault, Brenda's arrogant facade completely disintegrated into desperate primal panic. She realized with terrifying clarity that her physical domination of the space meant absolutely nothing without the digital keys to control it. Through the camera feed, I watched her fumble aggressively through her designer purse, her hands shaking violently as she retrieved her smartphone. Since I had permanently severed their devices from the local wireless network, she was forced to rely entirely on a weak, fluctuating cellular data signal to make an outward connection. I turned up the volume on my end, listening intently as she frantically dialed emergency services. When the dispatcher answered, Brenda did not request simple assistance or admit to a family dispute. Instead, she immediately launched into a wild, hysterical, and entirely fabricated narrative. She spun a dramatic, breathless lie, claiming that a dangerous, psychotic cyber intruder had maliciously hacked into her personal home system, locking her and her innocent family inside a freezing, dangerous trap. She wept theatrically into the receiver, begging for immediate police intervention to save them from the deranged terrorist controlling the property. She played the role of the terrified, helpless victim, with practiced, flawless precision, fully expecting the authorities to arrive and restore her stolen power. I stood silently on the icy porch, watching her desperate performance unfold with absolute, unwavering calm. Let her call the police, I thought, feeling the rhythmic, comforting heartbeat of my sleeping son against my chest. Her frantic, hysterical lies to the emergency dispatcher were merely the final necessary catalyst for her ultimate destruction. The authorities were not coming to rescue her from a cyber intruder. They were coming to facilitate the final public phase of my carefully orchestrated retaliation, and she was entirely unprepared for the devastating legal reality that was about to arrive on her stolen doorstep. The piercing wail of police sirens suddenly shattered the pristine silence of the upscale gated community. The noise tore through the freezing winter air, echoing against the manicured facades of the surrounding luxury properties. Flashing red and blue lights rapidly painted the frost-covered lawns and illuminated the dark street, drawing the immediate attention of my wealthy, nosy neighbors. Front doors up and down the block began to crack open as residents stepped out onto their expansive porches, wrapping their thick coats tightly around themselves to witness the highly unusual disruption in our normally tranquil neighborhood. Two police cruisers aggressively rounded the corner and screeched to a sudden halt directly at the base of my driveway. The officers parked their vehicles at sharp angles, completely blocking the exit path behind the obnoxious sport utility vehicle that had sparked this entire confrontation. Car doors slammed heavily as four uniformed officers emerged, stepping cautiously onto the icy concrete, with their hands resting defensively near their duty belts. They swept their high-powered flashlights across the chaotic scene, illuminating the scattered moving boxes, the ruined trash bags, and the discarded diaper bag resting in the frozen mud. The sweeping beams of light eventually settled on me, standing perfectly still on the front porch, with my newborn son secured safely against my chest. I remained completely motionless as two of the officers quickly ascended the porch steps to assess the situation, while the others approached the heavy custom front door. Following standard emergency protocols, the police utilized a specialized mechanical override tool to physically force the smart deadbolt to release its grip on the reinforced frame. The moment the heavy wood swung inward, the illusion of my mother being a trapped, helpless victim transformed into a spectacular theatrical performance. Brenda violently pushed her way past the officers and burst out onto the frozen lawn, stumbling dramatically, as if she had barely survived a harrowing hostage situation. She immediately launched into a frantic weeping victim act, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. She hysterically accused me of being a dangerous, deranged individual who had maliciously hacked into her personal security system and attempted to freeze her innocent family to death. She sobbed loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the property line to the eager ears of the watching neighbors, spinning a convoluted tale of terror and victimization. Her performance was a masterclass in manipulation, portraying herself as a loving grandmother who had simply arrived to help only to be ambushed by a psychotic cybercriminal. Moments later, Malik strutted out through the open doorway, eager to capitalize on the dramatic scene Brenda had just established. He puffed out his chest and aggressively postured his large frame, attempting to physically intimidate me, while simultaneously commanding the attention of the responding officers. He loudly and arrogantly demanded my immediate arrest, insisting that I was a completely unhinged trespasser who had unlawfully interfered with his personal property rights. He spoke with absolute, unwarranted confidence, attempting to assert supreme dominance over the situation. He forcefully explained to the police that he was the rightful and legal homeowner, aggressively detailing how he had recently transferred a massive six-figure down payment directly to a private investment fund to secure the estate. He gestured wildly toward his inappropriately parked vehicle and the scattered moving boxes, demanding the officers remove me from his porch so his family could finish unloading their belongings in peace. He painted himself as a successful, wealthy provider who was simply trying to move his wife and children into their new luxury residence when a disgruntled, estranged relative arrived to cause a chaotic scene. His utter conviction in his own fabricated authority was staggering, reflecting the deep web of lies he had been fed and the profound arrogance that prevented him from ever questioning the reality of his situation. The sheer audacity of his aggressive behavior only served to highlight the impending destruction of his fragile ego. He practically vibrated with indignant fury, continuously pacing across the frosted grass while glaring daggers in my direction. Brenda nodded vigorously alongside him, reinforcing his delusional narrative by actively playing the role of a traumatized elder who desperately needed law enforcement protection from her dangerously unstable daughter. Their combined theatrical presentation was entirely designed to force the police into making a rapid arrest without conducting any proper preliminary factual investigation into their wild, completely baseless ownership claims and extreme hostile demands. Throughout their entire hysterical performance and aggressive posturing, I remained completely and utterly stoic. I did not raise my voice, shed a single tear, or attempt to interrupt their frantic, desperate lies. I simply adjusted my coat around my sleeping baby, shielding him from the cold wind and the chaotic noise, while allowing my mother and brother-in-law to dig their own legal graves in front of sworn law enforcement officers. I waited patiently until the lead officer turned away from Malik and approached me requesting my identification and an explanation for the unfolding disturbance. With cool, analytical precision, I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I opened the highly encrypted work folder that contained the absolute undeniable proof of my ultimate authority. Without a single word of defensive argument, I calmly handed the officer my state-issued driver license, verifying my identity. Next, I provided the official state-registered documentation for the limited liability company validating my role as the sole managing director of the corporate entity. Finally, I pulled up the high-resolution digital copy of the notarized property deed, the absolute legal anchor of my fortress. The heavily watermarked document clearly displayed my corporate entity as the sole exclusive purchaser and rightful owner of the sprawling estate, leaving zero room for interpretation, ambiguity, or further argument. I stood firmly on the freezing concrete, watching the officer review the digital paperwork, completely confident that the impenetrable legal trap I had meticulously built was now springing shut around them with devastating, irrevocable force. The lead officer accepted my smartphone, his thick tactical gloves gripping the edges. He stepped back from the porch steps, distancing himself from the immediate tension, to examine the digital deed and the state-issued corporate registry for Leo Holdings. The frigid wind continued to whip across the manicured lawns of the gated community, but the scene felt suspended in a breathless, freezing vacuum. Brenda and Malik stood shoulder to shoulder on the frost-covered grass, their faces radiating an utterly misplaced sense of victory. They watched the officer intently, waiting for the exact moment he would produce handcuffs and escort me away from my own property. The officer unclipped the heavy radio receiver from his shoulder harness. The sharp metallic crackle of the police dispatch frequency pierced the quiet suburban night. He read my full legal name, my date of birth, and the specific corporate identification numbers tied to the company directly into the microphone. A heavy silence stretched across the driveway as the dispatcher cross-referenced the state property databases and local municipal tax records. Every second felt like an eternity, the freezing air biting at my skin, while I kept my newborn son securely insulated against my chest. Finally, the radio hissed back to life. The dispatcher's robotic, monotone voice resonated through the crisp night air, delivering a swift and absolute validation of my ownership. The transmission confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that the corporate entity belonged solely to me, and that the property was legally registered under my exclusive control. The atmospheric shift on the front lawn was instantaneous and palpable. The lead officer handed my smartphone back to me with a sharp, respectful nod, silently acknowledging my absolute legal authority over the sprawling estate. He pivoted smoothly on his heels, his entire professional demeanor transforming from neutral investigation to active law enforcement. The other three officers immediately followed his silent lead, mirroring his sudden change in posture. They stepped forward in a synchronized, tactical formation, effectively creating a solid wall between my physical position on the porch and the three individuals standing on the grass. Their heavy winter boots crunched aggressively against the frozen mud as they closed the distance. The officers' hands dropped instinctively to rest squarely over the tactical belts around their waists, their fingers hovering mere inches from their issued equipment. They were no longer treating my mother and brother-in-law as distressed, victimized homeowners seeking assistance against a rogue cyber intruder. Instead, they were now actively engaging them as hostile, aggressive trespassers, attempting to unlawfully occupy a private residential fortress. The smug, self-satisfied smirks that previously dominated Brenda and Malik's faces vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden wave of profound confusion. They visibly recoiled from the advancing officers, their arrogant postures crumbling as the terrifying reality of the legal shift began to register in their panicked minds. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of a few seconds, leaving them entirely vulnerable to the harsh consequences of their own elaborate deception. The lead officer directed his attention squarely at Malik, his voice projecting a firm, uncompromising authority that demanded absolute submission. He systematically dismantled Malik's aggressive claims of ownership, stating unequivocally that his name did not appear anywhere on the property deed, the corporate registry, or any municipal database associated with the address. The officer clarified that the sprawling five-bedroom smart home was legally entirely off-limits to him. Malik's broad shoulders slumped as the crushing weight of the officer's statement collided violently with his fabricated reality. The arrogant posturing facade he had maintained since pulling his flashy luxury vehicle into my driveway completely shattered, leaving behind an expression of sheer unadulterated horror. His eyes widened as the brutal truth of his financial ruin began to slowly click into place within his mind. The massive, life-altering down payment he had transferred was never submitted to a legitimate private investment fund or a certified escrow account. His entire life savings had been funneled directly into a convoluted, deceitful trap orchestrated by the very women standing next to him. Brittany had deliberately lied to her husband, aggressively siphoning his hard-earned money and secretly diverting every single penny directly to Brenda to fund her own luxurious lifestyle. The horrifying realization that he had been stripped of his wealth and manipulated by his own spouse hit Malik like a physical blow, leaving him visibly swaying on the frozen grass as the catastrophic scale of the financial betrayal consumed his entire reality. The psychological shockwave of the stolen money instantly ignited a vicious, explosive confrontation right on my meticulously landscaped front lawn. Malik spun around to face Brittany, his prior protective stance entirely replaced by raw, unfiltered fury. He stepped aggressively toward his wife, demanding an immediate, coherent explanation for the missing funds and the elaborate web of lies she had spun regarding their new home. Brittany shrunk back under his intense, overwhelming anger. Her perfectly curated, flawless image of the beloved, untouchable golden child completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. The former beauty queen resorted to ugly, panicked defensive tactics, her voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical screech as she attempted to deflect the blame onto Brenda. She waved her arms frantically, her designer winter coat slipping off her shoulders as she desperately tried to weave a new tapestry of excuses to placate her enraged husband. Their domestic dispute escalated into a loud, humiliating public spectacle, their overlapping shouts destroying the quiet tranquility of the upscale neighborhood. The wealthy, status-conscious residents of the gated community stood silently on their expansive porches and behind their brightly lit windows, eagerly soaking in every embarrassing detail of the fracturing marriage. The pristine, flawless illusion of my sister's perfectly successful life shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of a captivated audience. I stood securely on the elevated porch of my impenetrable fortress, holding my sleeping son tightly against my chest, and watched with cold detachment as the heavy consequences of their deceit systematically tore their lives apart. The lead officer stepped forward, his tactical posture extremely rigid and uncompromising. He delivered the final legal verdict with a booming, authoritative voice that cut through the freezing night air. He informed Brenda, Brittany, and Malik that they were currently committing criminal trespassing on private property. The officer explicitly outlined the immediate consequences of their unlawful occupation, stripping away any remaining illusions of negotiation or familial entitlement. He issued a strict, non-negotiable 30-minute ultimatum. They were granted exactly 1/2 hour to re-enter the freezing premises, gather whatever personal belongings they could physically carry, and vacate the estate entirely. The officer made it absolutely clear that if they remained on the property, Even 1 second past the deadline, they would be placed in handcuffs and forcibly removed in the back of a squad car. Malik stood totally paralyzed, his prior arrogant facade completely hollowed out by the serious looming threat of a criminal record. Brenda attempted to argue, opening her mouth to weave another manipulative narrative, but the officer instantly silenced her with a sharp raise of his hand. He tapped his wristwatch, officially starting the countdown, and ordered 2 of his deputies to escort the trespassers back inside to monitor their eviction. The humiliating procession filed back into the pitch-black, freezing interior of the house. Because my environmental override remained fully engaged, the ambient temperature inside had plummeted, matching the bitter winter chill of the outdoors. The heavy steel security shutters kept the spaces shrouded in absolute darkness. The escorting officers were forced to use their heavy tactical flashlights, the harsh beams of white light cutting through the shadows and illuminating the utter chaos my family had created. The packing process rapidly devolved into a frantic, disorganized scramble. Brittany proved entirely useless in the crisis. She collapsed onto the ruined living room sofa, sobbing hysterically over the explosive end of her marriage and the loss of the stolen funds, completely ignoring the urgent ticking clock. Her 3 children, confused and terrified by the cold darkness and the presence of armed police officers, began screaming and crying uncontrollably. Their loud wails echoed off the high ceilings, adding a suffocating layer of auditory panic to the freezing environment. Brenda, completely abandoning any pretense of grandmotherly care or maternal support for her weeping daughter, shifted into pure, selfish survival mode. She sprinted toward the master suite, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Under the stern, watchful eyes of the police escorts, she began violently ripping her expensive designer dresses and luxury handbags from the custom closet racks. Lacking proper luggage, she was forced to aggressively shove her prized high-end garments into cheap, thin black plastic garbage bags she found in the kitchen pantry. The sheer indignity of stuffing luxury silk and cashmere into disposable trash bags under the glare of police flashlights was a profound, poetic manifestation of her ruined facade. The officers continuously barked out time warnings, rushing them through the dark hallways and preventing them from lingering or attempting to steal any of my property. The rushed, uncoordinated evacuation highlighted their complete lack of preparation for the swift, brutal consequences of their deceit. Exactly 30 minutes later, the officers forcefully herded the chaotic group back out through the front door and onto the icy concrete of the driveway. A massive pile of black garbage bags and loose, unboxed items accumulated haphazardly on the frost-covered grass. The harsh reality of impending homelessness finally crashed over Brenda with devastating weight. The biting winter wind whipped through her thin clothing as she stared down the empty, dark street, realizing she had absolutely nowhere to go and no financial resources left to secure shelter. Desperation entirely overrode her pride. She stumbled toward the base of the porch steps and collapsed onto her knees, her designer pants soaking up the freezing mud. She launched into a final, highly theatrical display of emotional manipulation. She wept loudly, throwing her hands up toward me, begging for mercy and shelter. She spun a frantic, guilt-laden narrative centered entirely around the sacred bonds of blood and family loyalty. She pointed dramatically toward the shivering, crying children, attempting to weaponize their discomfort to force me into unlocking the doors. She wailed about the cruelty of the winter night, desperately hoping that my inherent empathy would override the massive, unforgivable betrayals she had committed just hours prior. I remained standing on the elevated porch, maintaining my physical and emotional high ground. I held my sleeping newborn securely against my chest, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling in the dirt, feeling absolutely zero pity, zero guilt, and zero obligation. The maternal instinct that she was desperately trying to exploit was completely reserved for the infant in my arms. I evaluated her frantic pleas through a lens of pure analytical ice. Instead of engaging in a heated argument or offering explanations, I simply mirrored the exact brutal logic she had proudly weaponized against me earlier that afternoon. I projected my voice clearly over her theatrical sobbing, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. I stated that my home was a sanctuary meant only for my true complete family. I coldly informed her that she had to make room for the family members who actually mattered and that she no longer factored into that equation. I stripped away her title, her authority, and her relevance in a single, unwavering declaration. I told her that her presence on my property was a liability I would no longer tolerate, cementing her absolute permanent exile into the freezing darkness. I watched the profound shock wash over her tear-stained face as my ultimate rejection finally registered. The surrounding police officers remained completely motionless, allowing my definitive boundary to stand unchallenged. The howling wind seemed to carry my final verdict across the silent, manicured neighborhood, confirming that my impenetrable digital and physical fortress was now entirely secure against her toxic deceit. The crushing weight of my final verdict hung in the freezing air. The financial betrayal regarding the stolen down payment had completely severed whatever bond remained between Brittany and her husband. Malik vibrated with an uncontrollable rage fueled by the loss of his life savings and the public humiliation of the neighborhood, watching his facade shatter. He ignored his weeping wife and mother-in-law on the frosted grass. Operating with a frantic energy, he marched past them toward the massive pile of black garbage bags scattered across the driveway. He did not bother searching for items belonging to his children or his spouse. Instead, he violently kicked aside anything that did not directly belong to him, single-mindedly hunting for his personal expensive possessions. He grabbed specific heavy bags and hurled them ruthlessly into the back of his luxury sport utility vehicle, slamming the trunk down with a metallic crash that echoed through the quiet street. Without a word of farewell, he stormed toward the driver's side door and threw himself inside. The powerful engine roared to life, slicing through the winter wind. He shifted into gear and peeled out of my driveway with reckless speed, the thick tires tearing deep, ugly grooves into my previously immaculate lawn. The heavy luxury SUV aggressively sped down the quiet, dark suburban street, leaving a thick trail of dark gray exhaust fumes billowing in its fast wake, instantly abandoning his utterly deceitful wife and highly manipulative mother-in-law to face the incredibly harsh, freezing winter elements completely on their own, without any shelter or protection. The sudden violent departure of their transportation instantly transformed Brenda and Brittany from arrogant invaders into destitute trespassers. They were now hopelessly stranded on the freezing concrete sidewalk bordering my property, shivering violently in the biting Chicago wind. They stood surrounded by the pathetic heap of cheap black trash bags containing their designer clothes, looking ridiculous under the glare of the police cruiser headlights. The law enforcement officers showed zero sympathy for their manufactured plight. The lead officer stood near his patrol car with his arms firmly crossed, signaling that the 30-minute eviction deadline was absolute and non-negotiable. The heavy idling engines of the police cruisers served as a menacing mechanical reminder that any attempt to linger or re-enter my property would result in immediate physical arrest. Realizing that her theatrical tears and manipulative pleas held zero power over the officers, Brenda finally retrieved her smartphone with trembling fingers. Stripped of my high-speed wireless network, she was forced to rely on a weak, fluctuating cellular signal to desperately search for a cheap late-night cab service willing to navigate the icy roads. They waited in absolute, miserable silence, the cold, crushing reality of their sudden permanent homelessness settling heavily over their shivering shoulders, while the bright, flashing red and blue police lights continually illuminated their profound, absolute public defeat in the neighborhood. I did not wait to watch the budget taxi arrive to collect the remnants of their shattered grand illusion. I turned my back on the freezing, chaotic scene unfolding on the street and carried my sleeping newborn son back across the threshold of our impenetrable fortress. I used my foot to firmly kick the heavy custom wooden door shut behind me, instantly severing the bitter winter draft in the hostile presence of my toxic relatives. The loud, solid click of the smart deadbolt engaging felt like the definitive closing of a dark, exhausting chapter. I stood in the ruined foyer taking a slow, deep breath before initiating the final systematic purge of their existence from my sanctuary. I retrieved my smartphone and accessed the central administrative dashboard of my smart home network. Moving with the cold, calculated precision of a professional data analyst, I executed a complete, comprehensive digital sweep. I permanently wiped every single temporary access code I had previously granted, completely deleting their digital fingerprints from the system architecture. I reprogrammed the biometric scanners, reset the master encryption keys, and reactivated the robust heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. I engaged the comprehensive perimeter security grid, arming every exterior camera, motion sensor, and window alarm to maximum sensitivity. The heavy steel security shutters remained firmly locked in place, providing an absolute physical barrier against the outside world. With the digital and physical perimeter completely secured, I finally allowed my entirely exhausted, trembling body to carefully sink down onto the edge of the ruined living room sofa. The dark, muddy boot prints staining the expensive white fabric were a small temporary price to pay for the absolute permanent security of my newly reclaimed home. The warm, comforting air from the revived heating system began to slowly circulate through the expansive rooms, chasing away the lingering winter chill. I looked down at Leo, who remained peacefully asleep against my chest, entirely oblivious to the massive, chaotic battle that had just been waged and won to protect his future. A profound, quiet peace settled over the sprawling house, a deep, resonant silence, free from the suffocating, narcissistic demands and endless manipulations I had endured for my entire life. I had successfully defended my son, my property, and my absolute independence. However, as I sat in the comforting warmth of the restored living room, my analytical mind refused to completely power down. The immediate physical threat had been successfully neutralized, but I knew with absolute chilling certainty that Brenda and Brittany would never accept their highly humiliating public defeat quietly. They were currently banished to the freezing streets, but the venomous, toxic entitlement that fueled their initial invasion would inevitably seek out a brand new avenue of attack. I stared into the quiet shadows of the secure house, allowing myself this brief, vital moment of restful peace, while my strategic mind simultaneously began calculating the incoming variables, preparing my digital defenses for the inevitable massive social fallout and the vicious smear campaign that was undoubtedly already brewing in the dark, bitter corners of their desperate minds. 72 hours passed in absolute physical tranquility inside my highly secured home. The restored central heating system maintained a perfect ambient temperature, and the heavily reinforced doors remained firmly locked against the outside world. I spent those 3 quiet days exclusively bonding with Leo, establishing a peaceful daily routine, completely devoid of the toxic, chaotic energy that had previously defined my entire life. However, my professional instincts kept my analytical mind on high alert. I knew my mother and sister were entirely incapable of accepting their public defeat gracefully. Across the city, squeezed into a damp, filthy motel room off the noisy interstate, their severely bruised egos were actively mutating into vindictive, aggressive rage. The cheap motel served as the perfect dismal backdrop for the initial phase of their retaliation. Surrounded by black garbage bags containing their wrinkled designer clothing, Brenda and Brittany began orchestrating a calculated digital assault designed to destroy my personal reputation and publicly punish me for asserting strict legal boundaries. Their sheer desperation for control and financial resources fueled a deeply malicious strategy that completely disregarded any semblance of truth or familial loyalty. They operated with a shared toxic synergy, fully prepared to sacrifice my entire standing in our local community simply to regain their lost leverage and exact their ruthless vengeance. Brittany eagerly took the lead in launching their public smear campaign, heavily leveraging her years of superficial experience, curating a flawless, manipulative online persona. She positioned herself under the flickering fluorescent light of the cramped motel bathroom, deliberately using the peeling yellow wallpaper behind her to maximize the visual aesthetic of sudden destitution. She spent consecutive hours recording and meticulously editing a deceptive video intended for maximum viral impact across multiple social media platforms. She utilized specific digital lighting filters to make her normally pristine face appear deeply exhausted and completely washed out, artificially enhancing the dark purple circles under her eyes. In the final uploaded footage, she produced a masterclass in theatrical deception. She wept uncontrollably into the camera lens, painting a horrifying, entirely fabricated picture of the events that had transpired on my manicured front lawn. She boldly claimed that I had suffered a sudden violent psychotic break immediately following my difficult delivery. She spun a malicious, highly detailed narrative, asserting that her deranged widowed sister had violently thrown her own mother and three innocent freezing children directly into the bitter winter snow in the absolute dead of night. She completely omitted any mention of her financial theft, the swift police intervention, or my absolute legal property ownership, expertly crafting a false narrative, where she was nothing more than a helpless, innocent victim of my supposed postpartum insanity. She uploaded the video with a series of tragic hashtags designed to quickly catch the attention of the local news outlets and local parent groups, completely ensuring that her fabricated story would spread far beyond our immediate social circle. While Brittany successfully weaponized her fake digital tears, Brenda focused her aggressive, calculating energy on weaponizing public sympathy for immediate financial gain. Operating from the sagging, uncomfortable mattress of the cheap motel bed, she launched a highly fraudulent crowdfunding campaign on a major national donation platform. She titled the campaign page with a desperate, sensationalized plea begging the public to save her family from sudden freezing homelessness. The extensive campaign description was a masterful display of predatory fiction, heavily padded with egregious, terrifying lies about my mental stability. Brenda explicitly wrote that the tragic, unexpected loss of my husband had caused me to completely lose my grip on reality, transforming me into a dangerous, unpredictable threat to my own flesh and blood. She detailed completely fabricated stories of my supposed erratic, aggressive behavior, claiming they needed emergency funds immediately to secure a safe, warm environment for her young, vulnerable grandchildren who had been left deeply traumatized by my sudden, cruel eviction. She set an exorbitant financial goal, attempting to quickly crowdfund her way back into a comfortable luxury lifestyle while simultaneously burying my moral character under a massive mountain of digital defamation. They published the weeping video and the fraudulent donation link simultaneously, directly tagging every single extended family member, mutual acquaintance, and local community group they could possibly find online. The sheer volume of lies embedded within the campaign text was designed to evoke immediate outrage and rapid, unverified financial contributions from completely oblivious strangers. The massive digital shockwave hit my secure network with the terrifying, destructive force of a hurricane. I was sitting quietly in the warm, peaceful nursery feeding Leo when my smartphone screen illuminated with a continuous, unrelenting stream of rapid notifications. The calculated misinformation spread through my extended family network like a contagious virus, instantly activating a swarm of blindly loyal flying monkeys. My notification center rapidly transformed into an endless cascading waterfall of absolute unhinged vitriol. Distant cousins I had not spoken to in over a decade flooded my private inbox with long paragraphs of intense, aggressive outrage and severe moral judgment. Aunts and uncles who never once bothered to check on my well-being after my husband passed away suddenly found the time to send blistering, furious text messages demanding that I immediately apologize to my traumatized mother and beg for her swift forgiveness. The tone of the incoming messages rapidly escalated from severe familial disappointment to outright aggressive hostility. Mutual friends who had viewed Brittany's highly edited weeping video began leaving extremely aggressive, highly visible comments on my private social media profiles, accusing me of being a heartless, cruel monster who deserved to be entirely alone. The digital mob mentality took over completely, resulting in anonymous accounts sending terrifying direct messages containing explicit physical threats and demanding immediate financial restitution for my supposedly unforgivable crimes against my own flesh and blood. I watched the overwhelming toxic barrage multiply across my glowing screen, remaining perfectly still in the quiet safety of my heavily fortified home, while the entirely fabricated digital storm raged fiercely outside my impenetrable walls. The digital onslaught raged across my devices with relentless fury, but I refused to grant my mother the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. A typical target of such a vicious smear campaign might have crumbled under the weight of the public humiliation or impulsively posted a frantic defensive rebuttal online. I did neither. Years of working as a senior data analyst had trained my mind to treat chaotic information simply as raw data points to be processed. I viewed their orchestrated social media attack not as a personal tragedy, but as a critical data leak that required immediate systematic containment. I sat perfectly still in the quiet warmth of my home office, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my son, sleeping in his bassinet nearby. The glowing screens of my dual monitors reflected in my eyes as I methodically muted every incoming notification channel. I severed their direct line to my emotional state, entirely ignoring the frantic messages from flying monkey relatives and enraged mutual acquaintances. Every hateful text message and every aggressive social media comment was quietly captured, documented, and filed away in a secure digital folder. I stripped away the emotional context of their vitriol, focusing purely on extracting the actionable evidence buried within their reckless public outbursts. My mother relied on manufactured hysteria to control the narrative, but she fundamentally failed to understand that hysteria leaves a messy, traceable digital footprint. I shifted my attention from the chaotic social media platforms directly to the impenetrable cloud-based server of my smart home security network. Operating with absolute cold precision, I bypassed the standard user interface and accessed the raw, archived surveillance data from the previous week. The system had meticulously recorded every single second of their hostile invasion in flawless, crystal-clear, ultra-high resolution. I pulled up the exterior camera feeds from the front porch, isolating the exact time frame of my violent eviction. I watched the high-definition playback with total clinical detachment. The footage captured the brutal, undeniable reality of the situation in perfect clarity. The video showed Brenda aggressively snatching my heavy diaper bag and hurling it onto the frozen concrete. A moment later, the camera perfectly recorded the horrifying sequence where she physically shoved a physically traumatized postpartum woman holding a fragile newborn directly into the freezing winter wind before slamming the heavy door shut. I downloaded the massive video file, applying unalterable timestamps to verify its absolute authenticity. Next, I accessed the interior living room cameras, extracting the precise footage of Brittany's 3 undisciplined children actively destroying my expensive, custom-ordered sofa with their filthy, muddy boots. The microphones clearly captured Brittany loudly and arrogantly, directing the cheap movers to haul my personal bedroom furniture into the basement. I combined these devastating high-definition videos with a complete mirror copy of Brenda's highly fraudulent crowdfunding campaign page, ensuring I captured all the egregious, terrifying lies she had published about my mental stability. With my digital arsenal completely assembled and perfectly organized into a single encrypted dossier, I initiated the next crucial phase of my retaliation. I had zero intention of fighting a messy public battle in the comment sections of neighborhood social media groups. I was taking this conflict straight to a sterile, unforgiving legal arena. I researched the most ruthless, highly rated defamation and real estate litigation attorneys in the greater Chicago area and immediately scheduled an emergency virtual consultation. Sitting upright at my desk, with an aura of absolute unwavering professionalism, I connected to the secure video call. The attorney on the screen was a sharp, unyielding professional who specialized in aggressively dismantling complex, fraudulent claims. I did not waste a single second of his expensive billable time on emotional venting or dramatic storytelling. Instead, I simply shared my screen and presented the meticulously categorized digital dossier. I calmly walked him through the undeniable sequence of events, providing the indisputable video evidence of the physical assault, the property destruction, and the subsequent coordinated digital defamation campaign. The attorney watched the high-definition security footage of Brenda shoving me out into the cold, and his professional demeanor instantly sharpened into a predatory legal focus. He explicitly noted that victims of familial abuse rarely arrived at his office with such a pristine, perfectly documented, and completely irrefutable chain of evidence. The overwhelming strength of my digital proof completely eliminated any need for a protracted investigative phase. The attorney recognized immediately that Brenda and Brittany had aggressively backed themselves into a highly precarious legal corner with their reckless public posts and fraudulent fundraising efforts. He rapidly drafted a devastating comprehensive cease and desist order that specifically targeted their ongoing social media smear campaign and the completely fabricated crowdfunding page. The legal document brutally outlined the severe federal consequences of wire fraud and public defamation, demanding the immediate removal of all false statements. However, I was absolutely not going to be satisfied with simply halting their current harassment. I instructed the attorney to escalate the retaliation to its maximum legal capacity. We went a massive step further than a simple warning letter. We formally drafted and officially filed a crushing $25,000 civil lawsuit directly against my mother and sister. The comprehensive lawsuit specifically targeted them for the deliberate, malicious destruction of my expensive private property, the severe intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the highly coordinated public defamation of my professional and personal character. The lawsuit was designed to be an absolute financial and legal nightmare for them, striking directly at the very resources they were so desperately trying to steal. As the attorney confirmed the official filing of the devastating legal paperwork, a profound sense of ultimate control settled over me. I securely logged out of the video conference and closed my laptop, feeling the immense, satisfying weight of absolute justice taking its natural, unrelenting course. The inescapable reality of their impending legal doom brought a cold, triumphant smile to my face in the quiet of my home. The agonizing winter eventually melted into a brisk Chicago spring, bringing with it the highly anticipated day of the civil hearing at the county courthouse. Several long months had passed since the freezing night of the eviction, and I had used every intervening day to meticulously fortify my legal strategy. I approached the imposing granite steps of the legal building feeling an absolute sense of calm clarity. I was not arriving as a grieving widow or a frightened new mother begging for protection. I arrived as an impenetrable fortress of cold, professional determination. I wore a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit, projecting an aura of complete financial and emotional stability. Secured firmly against my chest in a high-end ergonomic carrier was my son Leo. He was now several months older and resting incredibly peacefully, lulled to sleep by the rhythmic motion of my steady walking. I navigated the busy security checkpoints and crowded marble corridors with the detached precision of an executive walking into a routine corporate board meeting. I felt no lingering anxiety about facing the women who had attempted to destroy my life, because the digital evidence burning a hole in my attorney's briefcase guaranteed an absolute flawless victory. I entered the assigned courtroom and took my seat at the plaintiff's table, sitting perfectly upright with my hands folded neatly over my legal portfolio. My attorney sat beside me, radiating a quiet, predatory confidence. A few moments later, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, revealing the deeply theatrical arrival of my mother and sister. The contrast between my polished appearance and their carefully orchestrated physical presentation was immediately jarring. Brenda and Brittany had clearly spent hours coordinating their outfits to project maximum financial destitution and profound emotional suffering. They wore oversized, wrinkled clothing that looked intentionally unwashed and faded. My mother had deliberately foregone her usual heavy layer of expensive makeup, allowing the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom to highlight every line of stress and exhaustion on her face. Brittany had tied her normally immaculate hair into a messy, haphazard bun, dragging her feet across the floor as if the sheer weight of her victimhood was physically crushing her. They shuffled toward the defense table, keeping their heads bowed in a manufactured display of profound humility and devastating hardship. Before the judge even took his seat at the bench, Brittany initiated her desperate performance art for the benefit of the court staff and the few spectators present in the gallery. She began sniffling loudly, wiping away invisible tears with a crumpled tissue while making sure her voice carried across the quiet room. She aggressively played the role of the abandoned, abused wife, loudly lamenting the pending divorce from her husband Malik. She audibly wept about how Malik had ruthlessly emptied their remaining bank accounts and left her completely penniless to raise three traumatized children entirely on her own. She deliberately positioned herself as a tragic martyr, attempting to lay the entire blame for her shattered marriage and her resulting poverty squarely on my shoulders. Brenda wrapped a comforting arm around her weeping daughter, nodding sympathetically, while shooting venomous hostile glares in my direction. They were fully committed to selling the illusion that they were helpless, innocent refugees who had been violently displaced by a cruel, vindictive tyrant. I watched their pathetic charade without a single flinch or a shift in my posture, treating their dramatic display as nothing more than a poorly executed data manipulation attempt. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, signaling the official commencement of the civil hearing. Following the preliminary procedural formalities, the judge instructed the defense to proceed with their opening statements regarding the events of that winter night. The attorney representing my mother and sister stood up and launched into a highly aggressive, completely fabricated narrative designed to assassinate my character. He painted a horrifying picture of a cold, calculating tech worker who had weaponized her massive wealth and advanced technological skills against her own struggling family members. The defense attorney boldly claimed that I had orchestrated the entire smart home lockout out of pure malicious spite simply because I was jealous of my sister's formerly intact marriage. He spun a wild, convoluted conspiracy theory, asserting that I had deliberately trapped them outside in the freezing snow to exact revenge for petty childhood grievances. Furthermore, he aggressively presented the complete lie that Malik had indeed provided a massive cash down payment for the property. The defense argued passionately that my eviction of the family was an elaborate illegal scheme to steal Malik's hard-earned money and hoard the luxury estate entirely for myself. My attorney and I sat in absolute stony silence as the defense presented this towering monument of perjury to the court. A lesser lawyer might have immediately leaped up to object to the egregious lies, but my legal counsel was executing a far more devastating strategy. He allowed the opposing attorney to enter every fabricated detail, every dramatic lie, and every false accusation directly into the official, unalterable court record. He sat back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers and patiently letting them talk themselves into an inescapable corner of absolute documented perjury. Underneath the table, he quietly booted up his encrypted laptop, preparing the comprehensive multimedia presentation containing the raw, unedited security footage. He checked the cable connections to the large courtroom monitors, ensuring that our incoming digital strike would be broadcast with perfect, flawless audio and visual clarity. We were actively encouraging them to build their entire legal defense upon a foundation of absolute lies, fully knowing that the impending presentation of my digital arsenal would not merely contradict their story, but completely obliterate their credibility under oath. The trap was set perfectly, and I watched with cold satisfaction as Brenda and Brittany nodded along to their lawyer's opening statement, completely oblivious to the catastrophic legal ambush that was patiently waiting for them in the darkness. The opposing attorney concluded the fabricated opening statement, returning to the defense table with a smug expression of misplaced confidence. The defense team had built their entire foundation on a house of cards, assuming my grief made me a weak opponent. My legal counsel smoothly rose from his heavy leather chair, moving with the calculated grace of a predator executing a flawless strategy. He formally requested the court's permission to submit digital multimedia evidence directly into the official record. The judge granted the motion with a curt nod, prompting the bailiff to slightly dim the overhead fluorescent lights. The atmosphere in the courtroom instantly shifted from a tedious legal proceeding into a highly anticipated viewing. My attorney tapped a single key on his encrypted laptop, sending the high-definition security file directly to the large flat-screen monitors strategically mounted across the wood-paneled room. The crisp, vibrant colors of my smart home exterior materialized on the displays, capturing the freezing Chicago winter twilight with absolute, breathtaking clarity. The flawless resolution left absolutely zero room for visual ambiguity or technical manipulation defenses. The massive screens dominated the space, forcing every single person present to witness the unfiltered reality of my family dynamics. I sat perfectly still, rocking my sleeping son against my chest, feeling the satisfying weight of absolute justice, preparing to crush their towering monument of perjury. The silent courtroom watched intently as the undeniable truth of that freezing evening began to play out in front of the judicial bench. The advanced surveillance system had recorded the entire interaction from multiple pristine angles, capturing the precise moment the hostile invasion escalated into physical violence. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands, maintaining a mask of stony, impenetrable silence as the digital rendering exposed my mother's true nature. On the glowing screens, Brenda aggressively lunged forward, ripping my heavy diaper bag from my shoulder and carelessly hurling it onto the icy concrete walkway. The high-fidelity audio microphones embedded in the porch ceiling broadcasted every single cruel, entitled demand perfectly. The courtroom speakers resonated with the harsh reality of her ordering a recovering postpartum widow to the unfinished basement simply to accommodate her golden child. Then the most damning sequence played in agonizing detail. The monitors showed Brenda delivering a sudden violent physical shove directly to my chest. The sudden blunt force caused my fragile body to stumble backward, and the baby carrier secured against my torso jolted violently on the screen. The footage concluded with the heavy custom door slamming shut, followed by the unmistakable mechanical click of the smart deadbolt engaging, leaving a vulnerable mother and infant stranded in the bitter cold. The sheer brutality of the recorded assault elicited audible gasps from the small gallery of spectators, completely destroying any lingering shred of sympathy the defense had managed to cultivate. The immediate fallout within the courtroom was profoundly satisfying to witness. The manufactured illusion of destitute victimhood that Brenda and Brittany had painstakingly constructed completely evaporated into the chilled air. The theatrical tears that had been freely flowing down my mother's unwashed face instantly dried up, replaced by a sudden horrifying pallor of absolute panic. The undeniable weight of the evidence crushed her fragile lies, exposing the terrifying depths of her extreme maternal narcissism. The undeniable visual proof completely shattered her carefully rehearsed narrative of being a helpless grandmother victimized by a psychotic cybercriminal. Realizing that the entire foundation of their legal defense had just been vaporized in 4,000 pixel resolution, Brenda frantically attempted to interrupt the digital presentation. She scrambled out of her wooden chair, waving her hands erratically toward the large monitors. She stammered out a series of desperate, panicked excuses, attempting to convince the room that the crystal-clear footage was somehow taken entirely out of context or maliciously digitally altered. Her sudden frantic movements and rising voice only served to further dismantle her own credibility, highlighting the erratic aggressive behavior that the security cameras had just perfectly documented. Beside her, Brittany physically shrank down into her seat, desperately attempting to make herself as small and invisible as possible, as the catastrophic reality of their perjury set in. The defense attorney rubbed his temples, looking profoundly defeated by his client's disastrous performance. The presiding judge did not tolerate the chaotic interruption for a single fraction of a second. His reaction was swift, brutal, and utterly uncompromising. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp cracking force that instantly silenced the murmuring gallery and halted my mother's frantic stammering. He directed a look of such profound, palpable disgust toward the defense table that the sheer weight of his judicial authority seemed to physically push Brenda back into her seat. He strictly commanded her to remain completely silent, reminding her of the severe legal consequences of disrupting his courtroom. Her chest heaved with anxious, shallow breaths, the heavy silence amplifying her utter isolation within the justice system. For my entire life, I had watched my mother successfully manipulate teachers, neighborhood associates, and distant relatives, utilizing a toxic blend of fake tears and manufactured outrage to avoid accountability. I watched closely as her eyes darted around the stern, unforgiving faces of the court staff seeking a single sympathetic ally. She found absolutely none. The narrative of her entire existence culminated in this precise, devastating moment of total failure. She sat frozen under the intense, hostile glare of the judge, fully realizing that her lifelong ability to manipulate authority figures had been completely neutralized by cold, hard data. The irrefutable digital evidence had stripped away her charming maternal mask, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable ugly reality of a woman who had violently betrayed her own flesh and blood. I simply adjusted the blanket over my sleeping son, refusing to offer her an emotional reaction. The courtroom remained encased in heavy, silent judgment as the absolute finality of her public unmasking settled permanently over the legal proceedings. The heavy silence in the courtroom provided the perfect canvas for the next phase of our legal strike. My attorney smoothly transitioned away from the devastating security footage and directed the court's attention toward a new set of digital exhibits. He formally introduced the comprehensive documentation regarding the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. The large monitors previously displaying the physical assault now projected the highly sensationalized donation page my mother had published from her cheap motel room. My lawyer meticulously highlighted the exorbitant financial goal and the egregious fabricated stories detailing my supposed mental instability. He systematically exposed how Brenda had actively weaponized public sympathy, attempting to extort money from oblivious strangers by painting herself as a desperate homeless victim. To completely dismantle their remaining defense, my attorney then introduced a sworn legal affidavit obtained directly from Malik. He had eagerly provided the sworn testimony during his own contentious divorce proceedings, eager to punish his deceitful wife. The notarized document explicitly detailed how Brittany had aggressively siphoned his life savings under the false pretense of securing a real estate down payment. The affidavit provided a meticulous paper trail proving that Brittany had funneled the stolen cash directly into Brenda's personal bank accounts. My lawyer masterfully cross-referenced the dates of the stolen funds with the launch of the fraudulent donation campaign, proving a calculated predatory pattern of financial exploitation. The presentation painted a crystal-clear picture of two deeply manipulative women who utilized deceit and fraud to fund their luxury lifestyle at the direct expense of everyone around them. The presiding judge reviewed the final pieces of financial evidence, his expression hardening into absolute judicial fury. He shuffled the stack of papers on his bench and looked down at the defense table with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. He began his ruling by delivering a scathing verbal evisceration of my mother and sister, stripping away the last remaining shreds of their manufactured victimhood. He sternly condemned their actions, classifying their behavior as not just legally actionable, but profoundly morally bankrupt. The judge explicitly cited the extreme cruelty required to physically assault a recovering postpartum widow and a fragile newborn child, simply to steal residential real estate. He systematically dismantled their pathetic defense, stating clearly that their attempts to manipulate his courtroom with fake theatrical tears were a direct insult to the entire justice system. He noted that their complete lack of remorse and their ongoing efforts to publicly defame a grieving mother demonstrated a severe, dangerous level of entitlement. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the immense validation of hearing a neutral legal authority completely validate my reality and fiercely condemn the toxic abuse I had endured for my entire life. The judge concluded his blistering reprimand by reaching for his heavy wooden gavel. He raised it high and brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, definitive strike that echoed like a gunshot through the quiet room. He ruled unequivocally in my favor, legally cementing my absolute victory over their campaign of terror. The financial penalties the judge handed down were absolute and permanently devastating to their already precarious situation. He officially ordered Brenda and Brittany to pay the maximum civil penalty of $25,000 to compensate for the malicious property destruction, the intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and the highly coordinated public defamation. The judge explicitly noted on the official record that this aggressive financial judgment would result in immediate wage garnishment and the forced liquidation of whatever meager assets they still possessed. He effectively ensured they would spend the next decade drowning in the severe financial consequences of their own arrogant greed. However, my attorney had requested one final crucial measure of protection to guarantee my permanent peace. Recognizing the deeply volatile and vindictive nature of my relatives, the judge did not hesitate to grant this request. He retrieved a fresh legal document and signed an immediate permanent restraining order against both women. The ironclad legal decree strictly prohibited Brenda and Brittany from ever approaching my property, attempting any form of digital communication, or initiating any physical contact with me or my son Leo for the rest of their natural lives. The judge made it absolutely clear that any violation of this permanent boundary would result in their immediate arrest and mandatory jail time. The heavy final strike of the gavel officially sealed their total financial ruin and their absolute permanent exile from my existence, leaving them completely trapped in a legal cage of their own making. The court was formally adjourned, and the heavy tension in the room instantly dissolved into the crisp reality of absolute justice. I packed my encrypted smartphone and legal portfolio into my sleek leather bag, moving with quiet, victorious dignity. I adjusted the warm blanket over Leo, who remained peacefully asleep against my chest, unaffected by the monumental legal battle that had just secured his future. As my attorney and I prepared to exit the courtroom, I allowed myself one final glance toward the defense table. The brutal verdict was crushing the two women in real time. The terrifying reality of bankruptcy and permanent legal isolation had finally shattered their arrogant delusions. Brenda sat slumped in her chair, her face gray and hollow, staring blankly at the polished floor. Brittany openly wept genuine tears of sheer panic, realizing she was now destitute, facing a messy divorce, and saddled with a massive, unpayable legal debt. They were left with zero financial resources, no supportive family network to exploit, and a highly public permanent legal record detailing their extensive fraud and physical abuse. I turned my back on their ruined existence and walked confidently down the center aisle of the courtroom. My heels clicked steadily against the marble floor, echoing with the sound of liberation. I passed through the heavy wooden doors without casting a single backward glance, leaving them to suffocate in the dark wreckage of their toxic deceit, while I stepped forward into a bright, secure future. The crisp morning air outside the courthouse felt infinitely lighter as I secured Leo into his car seat and prepared to execute the final administrative phase of my retaliation. The sweeping legal victory was absolute, but the digital remnants of my mother's fraudulent victimhood still lingered on the internet like a stubborn, malicious stain that demanded immediate eradication. I did not wait for Brenda to voluntarily comply with the judge's orders. From the passenger seat of my ride back to the gated community, I authorized my legal team to initiate the immediate digital cleanup. My attorney functioned with ruthless efficiency, bundling the certified court transcripts, the signed permanent restraining order, and the formal civil judgment into a devastating legal package. He forwarded the entire dossier directly to the Fraud and Compliance Division of the crowdfunding platform hosting Brenda's fabricated campaign. The corporate response to our filing was swift and completely merciless. Presented with undeniable legal proof of wire fraud and active defamation, the platform administrators permanently suspended the campaign within 2 hours of the court adjournment. They triggered an automated protocol that instantly reversed every single transaction, fully refunding the oblivious donors and completely severing my mother's final desperate lifeline to unearned wealth. The fraudulent webpage, which had been the crown jewel of their malicious smear campaign, was replaced by a sterile generic error message. I watched the link die on my phone screen, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction, as their meticulously crafted digital illusion was entirely scrubbed from existence. The sudden disappearance of the donation page served as the initial shockwave, but the true reckoning arrived when the unfiltered reality permeated the extended family network. Public court records are easily accessible to anyone willing to look, and my attorney ensured that the unedited high-definition security footage was no longer shielded by pending litigation. The raw video of Brenda violently shoving a recovering postpartum widow and a fragile newborn onto a freezing porch circulated rapidly through the same gossip channels that had previously condemned me. The irrefutable visual evidence of my mother's brutality, coupled with the staggering $25,000 judicial verdict against her, completely shattered the false narrative she had fed to our relatives. The reaction from the flying monkeys was immediate and utterly pathetic, demonstrating a profound lack of personal integrity. The exact same distant cousins and aggressive aunts who had previously bombarded my inbox with vicious death threats and intense moral judgment suddenly flooded my phone with a desperate barrage of backpedaling apologies. My notification center filled with cowardly, stammering voicemails and long, groveling text messages. They offered flimsy, transparent excuses, claiming they had been maliciously misled by Brenda and insisting they had always known I was a good person deep down. They desperately attempted to rewrite their own history of toxic harassment, pleading for a chance to rebuild our family bridges now that my financial and legal dominance was publicly undeniable. I sat at my home office desk, evaluating their sudden reversal with the cold, detached scrutiny of a professional data analyst identifying a corrupted data set. A weaker person might have seized the opportunity for reconciliation, eager to accept the groveling validation from relatives who had previously cast them out. I felt absolutely zero desire to grant them that unearned absolution. Their apologies were not rooted in genuine remorse or a sudden realization of my inherent worth. Their desperate backtracking was entirely motivated by the terrifying realization that they had publicly aligned themselves with a legally documented fraudster and a physically violent abuser who had lost. They were scrambling to distance themselves from the blast radius of Brenda's monumental failure. I refused to let their toxic conditional loyalty infect my secure sanctuary. Operating with absolute unwavering resolve, I systematically purged my communication channels. I did not reply to a single message, nor did I offer any explanations or engage in any performative forgiveness. Instead, I executed a meticulous, permanent digital blockade. I went through my contact list and blocked every single relative, mutual friend, and distant acquaintance who had participated in the smear campaign. I severed their access to my phone, my social media profiles, and my email account, slamming down an iron boundary that no amount of pathetic pleading could ever breach. I transformed my digital landscape into a highly curated, impenetrable fortress, permanently excising the generational toxicity that had plagued my entire existence. With the external threats completely neutralized, I turned my absolute focus inward, dedicating my energy to physically healing the sanctuary they had attempted to destroy. The custom-ordered white sofa, deeply stained and irreparably ruined by the muddy winter boots of incredibly unruly children, was hauled away by a discreet professional removal service. I purposefully replaced it with a plush, deep navy sectional, selecting a durable, comfortable fabric that invited relaxation rather than anxiety. I hired highly specialized contractors to efficiently repair the deep gouges in the hallway drywall, applying fresh, warm coats of paint that completely erased the visual scars of the movers' reckless invasion. I systematically purged the house of the chaotic, lingering energy they had introduced, restoring the pristine, organized environment that grounded my analytical mind. The sprawling, five-bedroom smart home finally became the haven I had originally envisioned. I spent my weekends designing the perfect nursery for Leo, filling the bright, sunlit room with soft textures, educational toys, and an atmosphere of absolute, unconditional love. The heavy steel security shutters, once a necessary tactical defense against my own mother, now remained open to let in the vibrant golden light of the Chicago spring. I sat quietly on the brand new sofa, holding my son close to my chest, listening to his soft, contented coos echoing through the quiet, peaceful rooms. The house was no longer just a heavily fortified investment property or a toxic battleground for familial dominance. It was a true home entirely dedicated to peace, security, and the beautiful, untouched future I was building exclusively for my son. A full year passed, turning the bitter memories of that freezing winter into distant echoes. Spring arrived with brilliant warmth, perfectly coinciding with my son Leo reaching his first birthday. My sprawling smart home no longer felt like a fortified military bunker. It was simply a home. The deep navy sectional in the living room was now covered in colorful building blocks and plush toys. My professional life mirrored the thriving energy of my sanctuary. I had recently been promoted to lead data analyst. I spent my mornings working from my newly renovated sunlit home office on the second floor. The large windows offered a peaceful view of the manicured gated community. I sat in my ergonomic chair, sipping warm coffee, while reviewing predictive models on my dual monitors. The hum of the climate control system was the only sound competing with the babbling from the baby monitor on my desk. The contrast between the terrified widow I had been 12 months ago and the empowered executive I was today felt absolutely profound. I had built a completely impenetrable life, insulated by financial security, legal boundaries, and an unshakable sense of total self-worth. My peaceful morning routine was interrupted by a notification from the smart security application. The external cameras captured the postal worker depositing daily mail into the secure lockbox at the edge of my driveway. Taking a screen break, I walked downstairs and out into the crisp spring air to retrieve the stack. The delivery consisted of utility bills, financial statements, and birthday cards from loyal colleagues and supportive neighbors. However, buried near the bottom of the stack was a highly irregular letter. It was a cheap, thin, crumpled white envelope that stood out against the heavy cardstock of the other letters. There was no return address printed in the corner, but the jagged, erratic handwriting betrayed the identity of the sender. The familiar looping cursive spelling out my name belonged unmistakably to my mother. Even though Brenda was prohibited by a permanent judicial order from initiating physical or digital contact, she had resorted to the postal service in a cowardly attempt to bypass the legal blockade. Holding the cheap envelope, my analytical mind automatically processed the objective data regarding my mother's current existence. The staggering $25,000 civil judgment I had secured against her and Brittany had completely annihilated their financial standing. Through mandatory court filings and public wage garnishment records, I knew exactly how steep their fall from grace had been. Brenda, the woman who previously obsessed over designer labels and demanded the master suite of my estate, was now completely destitute. She was forced to move into a tiny, run-down studio apartment in a neglected neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. To satisfy the monthly court-mandated payments drained directly from her bank accounts, she had been forced to secure grueling, humiliating employment. At 55 years old, she was currently working exhausting shifts as a minimum wage cashier at a retail store. The woman who had once weaponized her unearned wealth to manipulate everyone was now spending her days standing on her feet for 8 hours, ringing up cheap merchandise just to survive. The absolute brutal reality of her impoverished life was an undeniable consequence of her own malicious greed and violent entitlement. I stood in the center of my bright, immaculate foyer, staring down at the crumpled envelope resting in my palm. A year ago, seeing her handwriting would have triggered a massive, debilitating spike of anxiety and a rush of adrenaline. I would have braced myself for the emotional manipulation, the toxic guilt trips, and the suffocating pressure to surrender my boundaries. But in this moment, I took a slow, deliberate physical inventory of my bodily responses. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. My breathing was completely calm and deeply measured. My hands did not shake, and my stomach did not twist into nervous knots. I felt absolutely no lingering anger, no residual sadness, and no desire for vengeance. The only emotion that washed over me was a profound, absolute indifference. The opposite of love was never hate. The true opposite of love was complete apathy, and I had finally achieved it. I could feel the toxic energy radiating from the thin paper. I knew with absolute certainty that the pages inside were filled with frantic pleas for unearned forgiveness, fabricated claims of change, and manipulative demands for access to my son. She wanted a second chance to infect my life with her chaos. I did not need to open the envelope or read a single word of her predictable script to know what lies she had written. I carried the unopened envelope upstairs, walking with steady, purposeful steps back into my sunlit home office. I bypassed my desk entirely and walked directly over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder resting securely against the far wall. I pressed the power button, bringing the powerful mechanical device to life with a low, menacing hum. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I did not tear the seal to peek at her words or indulge any morbid curiosity about her pathetic apologies. In a deeply satisfying silent motion, I dropped the unopened, crumpled envelope straight into the steel opening. The sharp, interlocking metal teeth caught the cheap paper, immediately pulling it downward with aggressive, violent force. I watched with absolute cold satisfaction as the last physical tether to my toxic mother was instantly dragged into the machine. The heavy mechanical gears ground the desperate pleas, the fake tears, and the manipulative lies into hundreds of tiny, irretrievable paper ribbons. The shredder finished its task, returning to a quiet, steady hum. I turned the machine off, severing the final ghostly connection to my past. I walked back to my desk, my mind entirely clear, and my emotional fortress perfectly intact, ready to focus completely on the beautiful, secure future I was building for my son. The beautifully clear morning of my son's very first birthday dawned with a brilliantly bright golden light steadily streaming through the massive front windows of our quiet living room. I spent the early hours transforming the main floor into a vibrant, colorful wonderland. Bright blue and silver balloons floated against the high ceilings, and a massive custom-designed banner displaying Leo's name hung proudly across the fresh, pristine drywall. I connected my smartphone to the integrated surround sound system, filling every corner of the house with upbeat, joyful acoustic music. The lively melodies echoed through the wide hallways, creating an atmosphere radiating with pure, unadulterated warmth. As I arranged the catered trays of food and perfectly frosted cupcakes on the kitchen island, my mind briefly flashed back to the stark, terrifying contrast of this exact space 1 year prior. The memory of the freezing, pitch-black rooms, the shattered wine glass on the hardwood floor, and the suffocating presence of hostile invaders felt like a distant, fading nightmare. Today, the climate control system hummed a comforting, steady rhythm, maintaining a perfect, cozy temperature. My smart home, once weaponized as a cold, tactical fortress to repel an active threat, had fully blossomed into a vibrant, welcoming sanctuary, completely dedicated to celebrating new life. I wiped down the spotless countertops, feeling a deep surge of pride in the pristine environment I had carefully curated and fiercely protected. Every decorative detail represented a deliberate choice to foster joy and permanently banish the dark shadows of the previous winter. The digital chime of the front gate security system signaled the arrival of our first guests. I walked to the heavy custom front door, opening it wide to welcome the crisp spring air and the people who truly mattered. There was not a single drop of shared DNA among the individuals crossing my threshold, yet the bonds connecting us were infinitely stronger than any biological tie. My closest colleagues from the data analytics firm arrived first, carrying brightly wrapped packages and offering warm, genuine embraces. They were the professionals who had covered my shifts, shielded my career, and provided absolute stability during the chaotic media circus my mother had orchestrated. Shortly after, the driveway filled with the vehicles of my loyal neighbors from the gated community. These were the residents who had witnessed the explosive public eviction on my front lawn, and immediately recognized the truth, stepping up to offer their unwavering support and reliable witness testimonies when the smear campaign reached its peak. The foyer, once the epicenter of a violent, destructive invasion, now echoed with bright, melodic laughter and the comfortable chatter of authentic, respectful connections. I greeted every single person with profound gratitude, taking their coats and feeling the immense protective energy they brought into my home. They treated my personal space as a truly sacred area. The birthday celebration shifted into the main living area, blooming into a beautiful display of absolute joy and hard-won independence. I stood near the kitchen counter, taking a deliberate moment to quietly observe the beautiful reality I had successfully engineered. My son Leo sat comfortably in the center of the plush navy blue sectional, his face lit up with a massive, toothless smile. He giggled uncontrollably as one of my senior coworkers performed a silly magic trick with a colorful ribbon. Watching my child laugh with such pure, unburdened innocence filled my chest with an overwhelming, radiant heat. He was completely safe, entirely insulated from the generational trauma and toxic manipulative behaviors that had poisoned my own childhood. The people surrounding him did not view him as a pawn in a twisted familial power struggle or a tool to extract financial resources. They simply saw a happy, thriving little boy, and they interacted with him using nothing but pure, uncomplicated kindness. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the individuals who had actively chosen to protect and uplift us. They treated my home with absolute respect, honoring the physical and emotional boundaries I had fought so fiercely to establish. The crushing weight of familial obligation had been entirely replaced by the uplifting, buoyant freedom of mutual chosen respect. There was no walking on eggshells, no decoding passive-aggressive comments, and absolutely no fear of sudden betrayal. The environment was stable, predictable, and entirely nurturing, reflecting the exact emotional baseline I had always desired but never received growing up. As the afternoon progressed, I stepped back toward the large bay windows overlooking the front porch. The exact spot where I had once stood barefoot and bleeding, clutching my newborn against the bitter winter wind, was now bathed in warm, dappled sunlight. A deeply profound and incredibly crystal clear realization suddenly settled deep into my weary bones. The archaic societal concept that family is strictly defined by blood and genetics was a dangerous, manipulative lie. True family is absolutely not just a default assignment granted at birth. True family is simply an active, continuous choice, demonstrated through consistent, respectful, and protective actions. The people currently filling my home had earned their place in my life by showing up when it truly mattered, by respecting my autonomy, and by offering support without a single hidden agenda or manipulative condition. I had successfully excised the malignant tumor of my biological relatives, leaving behind a clean, healthy space for genuine love to take root and flourish. The journey from that freezing, terrifying lockout to this moment of absolute, unshakable security had demanded a ruthless, analytical excision of everything toxic in my life. I had utilized every ounce of my professional logic and maternal ferocity to dismantle their deceit and protect my sanctuary. Looking at the vibrant, joyful celebration continuing in my living room, I knew with absolute certainty that the brutal sacrifices and the ruthless legal battles were entirely worth it. I had built a completely impenetrable life, insulated by financial security, unyielding boundaries, and a chosen family that would never leave us out in the cold. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the living room as the celebration reached its pinnacle. I stepped into the kitchen and retrieved the birthday cake I had carefully prepared for my son. It was a simple but beautiful creation, covered in bright blue frosting and adorned with a single glowing candle. I carried the cake back into the main room, surrounded by the encouraging cheers and applause of my chosen family. The soft, flickering light of the small flame illuminated Leo's wide, fascinated eyes. I knelt beside him, balancing the heavy ceramic plate, and guided his tiny hand toward the candle. We blew out the flame together, extinguishing the tiny fire with a single breath. The rising wisp of white smoke carried a profound symbolic weight. Extinguishing that single candle represented the definitive closure of the darkest, most terrifying chapter of my entire existence. I had successfully navigated the suffocating grief of sudden widowhood and survived the brutal betrayal of my biological relatives. The extinguished flame marked the absolute end of their toxic reign, while the sweet scent of vanilla sugar signaled the lighting of a brand new beautiful era, entirely defined by peace and autonomy. The collective joy in the room swelled, providing a perfect harmonious conclusion to the lively afternoon festivities, marking the official beginning of a bright, secure future. The energetic gathering naturally wound down as the early evening approached. I stood by the heavy custom front door, bidding farewell to every single guest with profound gratitude. I watched their vehicles slowly pull out of my expansive driveway, leaving behind a serene, deeply comforting silence. I secured the front entrance and began a slow, methodical walk through the expansive rooms of my home. The chaotic mud stains and the harsh, violent echoes of the previous winter were completely gone, replaced by immaculate hardwood floors and the soft, ambient lighting of a secure sanctuary. I approached the central smart home control panel mounted on the main hallway wall. My fingers grazed the cool glass screen, waking the high-resolution digital display. A year ago, I had utilized this exact interface as a desperate digital weapon to trap my hostile invaders and protect my fragile newborn. I reviewed the security perimeters, the sophisticated climate controls, and the active high-definition camera feeds. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I was no longer checking the digital security metrics out of a frantic, hyper-vigilant anxiety or a desperate need for survival. I reviewed the glowing data points with a deep, resonant sense of absolute ownership and immense personal pride. The sprawling fortress belonged entirely to me, and I commanded its complex systems with the calm, unwavering authority of a woman who had fought a massive, brutal battle and emerged completely victorious in every conceivable metric. I smiled at the glowing control screen, feeling utterly empowered by the digital boundaries that kept my small family entirely safe from external harm. The overwhelming peace of my secure environment provided a stark, brutal contrast to the chaotic misery currently consuming my younger sister. My legal team had kept me apprised of the highly public fallout stemming from the catastrophic failure of her marriage. Brittany was currently navigating a highly explosive, incredibly messy divorce from her husband, Malik. The massive financial theft involving his stolen life savings had completely destroyed their relationship, resulting in bitter, protracted legal battles over their remaining non-existent assets. Stripped of the stolen funds and completely cut off from the luxurious lifestyle she had always felt inherently entitled to, Brittany was now experiencing the harsh, unforgiving reality of absolute poverty. Her former status as the flawless, untouched golden child of our family had completely evaporated into thin air. She was living in a cramped, decaying apartment, desperately trying to manage her unruly children without any financial support or maternal bailouts to rescue her. The perfectly curated social media illusion she had spent years building was permanently shattered, replaced by the agonizing daily struggle of facing severe consequences for her own malicious actions. She had aggressively attempted to steal my sanctuary to fund her arrogant entitlement, but her relentless greed had ultimately engineered her own spectacular permanent downfall, ensuring she would never again threaten my peace or manipulate my resources for her personal gain. I pushed the pathetic image of her ruined existence completely out of my mind and walked upstairs toward the second-floor nursery. I stepped quietly into the dimly lit room approaching the solid wooden crib. Leo was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady, comforting rhythm. I stood over him, feeling an immense, powerful wave of maternal triumph wash over my entire soul. I looked down at his peaceful, resting face, knowing with absolute certainty that I had successfully protected his financial inheritance, his physical home, and his emotional peace. The sprawling luxury estate and the corporate entity shielding it remained completely impenetrable against external threats. I had stood my ground against the most manipulative, toxic forces in my life, and I had won the ultimate war for our freedom. The vicious cycle of generational trauma and the deeply destructive golden child dynamics that had poisoned my own upbringing were now permanently broken, never to be repeated under my roof. My son would never experience the agonizing pain of conditional love or the terrifying threat of sudden familial betrayal. He would grow up in an environment built entirely on a solid foundation of fierce protection and unwavering respect. I gently pulled the soft cotton blanket over his small shoulders, sealing my unspoken, eternal promise to him. I had survived the freezing darkness of their betrayal and successfully built a brilliant, unbreakable dawn for our new life together. I stood silently in the quiet nursery, watching him breathe peacefully, knowing our future was finally secure and completely our own. Every single painful sacrifice had been absolutely worth it to completely guarantee his lifelong safety away from their endless chaotic toxicity forever. I stepped away from the glowing monitors of my home office and made my way down the sweeping wooden staircase. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pristine hardwood floors of the foyer. I reached the heavy custom front door and pushed it open, stepping out onto the exact same concrete porch where I had once been violently banished. The physical space was identical, but the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The brutal, biting Chicago winter wind that had threatened to freeze my newborn son was completely gone. In its place, a warm, inviting spring breeze drifted through the manicured trees of the gated community, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and fresh rain. I stood near the edge of the landing, feeling the gentle sun on my face. The heavy mechanical smart lock resting on the doorframe behind me was no longer a symbol of my sudden terrifying exile. It was now a steadfast guardian firmly under my absolute command. I looked out over the driveway where my mother and sister had haphazardly piled their garbage bags full of designer clothes. The grass was lush and green, completely erased of the deep, muddy tire tracks left by my fleeing brother-in-law. Standing on the sunlit porch, I took a moment to deeply reflect on the incredible swiftness of their absolute downfall. The entire foundation of their toxic power had relied entirely on the assumption that I would submit to their emotional terrorism. My mother and sister had spent their entire lives operating under the delusion that their aggressive entitlement could bend reality to their will. They believed that loud demands and fabricated victimhood could override legal documentation and empirical data. Watching their carefully constructed illusion shatter into a million irreparable pieces was a masterclass in the fragility of narcissistic abuse. When directly confronted with absolute irrefutable consequences, their unearned authority crumbled instantly. The devastating speed with which they lost everything was a direct mathematical result of their own malicious calculations. They gambled my physical safety for their own luxury, and the resulting financial and legal ruin was simply the universe balancing the equation. Looking back at the sprawling 5-bedroom estate, I realized that this property was no longer just an expensive collection of brick mortar and advanced technological wiring. This smart home stood as a towering physical monument to my absolute personal victory. It was a tangible, undeniable manifestation of my resilience, a fortress built from the ashes of their profound betrayal. Every single corner of this massive sanctuary now resonated with an undeniable frequency of complete liberation and total security. The journey from being a desperate, marginalized daughter to becoming the undisputed architect of my own secure universe required a ruthless shedding of societal expectations. I know intimately the deep, suffocating pain of being cast as the permanent scapegoat in a deeply toxic family dynamic. It is a very specific type of invisible agony to realize that the people biologically programmed to nurture and protect you view you merely as a disposable resource. You spend years twisting yourself into uncomfortable shapes, hoping that if you just become successful enough or accommodating enough, they will finally offer a fraction of the love they shower upon the golden child. But the game is entirely rigged from the start. You cannot earn respect from individuals who fundamentally lack the capacity to give it. Walking away from that deeply ingrained pursuit of maternal validation is the hardest, terrifyingly liberating choice a person can make. You have to be willing to stand entirely alone in the freezing cold before you can ever learn how to build your own fire. You have to deeply mourn the supportive parents and caring siblings you truly deserved but never actually had. Only after you process that profound grief can you clearly see the incredible potential of a life built entirely upon your own uncompromising standards. The sheer magnitude of my resulting success proves that severing these toxic biological ties does not break you, but instead allows you to finally breathe. Finally, the absolute most liberating truth I discovered during my year of intense rebuilding is that you are not obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep your toxic abusers warm. Choosing your own mental health and financial security over the toxic demands of your biological relatives is not an act of cruel selfishness. It is a profound necessary act of absolute survival. The guilt they attempt to weaponize against you is merely a tool designed to keep you compliant and manageable. Once you stop reacting to their manufactured emotional crises and start operating purely on logic and firm boundaries, their power over you completely evaporates. You strip away their leverage the moment you realize that true peace requires excising the malignant forces from your daily life, regardless of the shared genetics. My son will never know the hollow aching feeling of trying to please a deeply unpleasant grandmother. He will never be measured against a flawless golden child cousin. He will grow up surrounded entirely by individuals who value his existence without any hidden conditions or manipulative strings attached. I broke the devastating cycle of generational trauma by utilizing the exact same cold analytical precision that fueled my professional career. I actively turned my profound grief into an impenetrable shield and permanently transformed my vulnerability into an absolute unyielding strength. This beautiful home now stands as a permanent testament to the unwavering power of establishing ironclad boundaries against those who seek to tear you down for their own selfish gain. I reclaimed my sanctuary and my brilliant future by simply refusing to negotiate with highly manipulative emotional terrorists who sought to break my spirit. Have you ever had to use cold hard facts to dismantle a toxic family member's lies? How did you protect your peace when the people who were supposed to love you tried to leave you out in the cold? Let me know in the comments below.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And drives me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every